Okay, so in the previous video, we talked about the basics of the previous video would be session number 8. We talked about the basics of XAML. What is XAML? What are the declarative document languages? And we sort of like touched on the subject of how XAML really is formatted and works. In this video, what I want to show you is we want to go through a very simple tool. Just create a window, a couple of buttons, do something very, very small and silly, but basically go through the process of setting up a GUI tool in pyRevit using IronPython and XAML as sort of the language that describes the user interface. So I'm going to go to Windows here. I'm going to open a directory that I've already set up. This is under the pyRevit tutors panel. So if you get the new version of pyRevit, the final, the 4.7 final, then you can activate this pyRevit tutors tab. The extension, and it has this sort of like session 8 or session 9 in this case tool that we have created here. Let's actually go and rename this tool to session 9 now. And I'm going to also reload here. Okay. And let's go and close these because I've opened them from the previous directory. Okay. So in this bundle, I have an icon file, which is basically just the XAML icon that we used, icon for the tool. Super simple. Standard script, Python script, which we have created many times on the pyRevit. That part has no surprise. But we also have an extra file that is a XAML file. I've named it UI. You could name it anything else, but it sort of like makes sense. If that's a script, that's the UI. So keeping it simple would be very beneficial for the future. I'm going to put the script on the side and UI on this side, and we'll get to talk about these two. The first thing that you need to do under pyRevit using IronPython to be able to sort of like load up a XAML file is to import CLR and add the two system Windows forms and IronPython WPF namespaces, references basically. You want to add these two references to these two DLLs, and then at that point we can import WPF and we can import windows from system to be able to use the base window and stuff like that. So make sure you have these sort of like wrappers covered, the imports covered. And then the second part of the script, I'm using the script module inside pyRevit to get the bundle file, get the path of this file, wherever that is. It's generally a good practice to use this method to get a full path to your bundle file, because you don't know when this is distributed to somebody else's directory structure, where is it actually sitting. So you always use that script, get bundle file, give it the file name. It'll look into the bundle, the current bundle, and grab that the full path of that XAML file for you. What we want to do at this point is to import WPF, which is going to be coming from the IronPython.wpf DLL. And this is the WPF engine that we are going to use to load the XAML file that we have created, which is going to be this, for our bundle inside the script, and sort of like, assign all the functions and tie it to the class that we have. And then now we need to import the base window class from system. So system windows.window, which is the window under the system windows, is going to be our base class for the window class where we're going to create. What is happening here is that if I go back to my drawing, what's happening is that this is if this is our script, and as our script is being executed, we use WPF to sort of like get access to the XAML or WPF engine, let's say, and we'll give it the path of this XAML file that we have created. It'll load it up. It would generate the components for the window and everything else. But before that, it kind of needs to have access to this sort of like code behind class that we have. We also provide that to the engine, and wrap and we create these components, attach it to the window, to this window here, set the properties and everything else, and also find the methods and everything else that is related to, like if there's a function that needs to handle the click on the button, it'll also exist inside as a sort of like a method on that class. So we kind of need to define this class as a code behind for this window sort of like the XAML WPF engine can tie all the logic and functions and everything else to this sort of like window. Um, it's incredibly important that the type that we're using here matches the type that we use here, because this is our base class. This is our base. This is the root of that window, which is going to be a Windows window base wrapper. You might have other sort of like windows that are using from other DLLs and stuff like that. They in turn all based on this. So eventually you'll have this window somewhere in the parent hierarchy of the class that you're using. But for this case, you don't really have to worry about it. So just a class, give it a name. It'll be an inherited class from this window. There's so many properties and functions and methods and stuff implemented in this window that we don't re-implement here because our class is sort of like subclassing that main base class. And then we got to define the init, the initialization method, dunder method, and then inside it we say WPF load component will pass the self, which is the instance of this class, to this load component and the path of the XAML file that we have, and the engine will take these two, the path and the instance, and sort of like it creates the UI and tie it to this class that we have. So at this point, and then sort of like when we define all of this, then to show our window, we're going to create an instance of the window class, this new window class that we defined. You could assign it to a variable, maybe say, I don't know, my window equals, grab this, my window, and then you can say my window show dialog, or the other way. It really doesn't matter. If you need to set other properties, you could save it in a variable. Otherwise, you can just say my window show dialog. A lot of times in my codes, I pass it sort of like, you can say XAML file or XAML file name, and then you could put this stuff in here, and you can put the XAML file name in here. And then you can pass the name to the class that you have. So fairly simple. My window, deleted that accidentally. It'll get passed to the constructor for that class, initializer for that class, and it gets passed to their script, get bundle file, it gets the path and everything else and loads it into this component. This is how the forms, that window work inside the pyRevit forms, which we'll get to in other videos, and I'll show you the facilities that pyRevit has to create and sort of like simplify your job of creating these windows. A lot of this stuff will be automated when you actually start using pyRevit's internal basically UI helpers and whatnot. So that would make it a lot simpler. But at this level, I want to show you everything that's running behind. There's no ties to pyRevit at this point, except for the fact that we're just using that script to get the path to that XAML file, and that's it. Everything else, you could use it anywhere outside of pyRevit, inside IronPython or whatever other environment that uses IronPython. So for our XAML file, as we discussed before, I'm creating a window as a root. But at this point, if I go, as we talked about this before, if I go and run this, I'm going to get an error that's going to tell me I don't know what window is. So I'm going to get an error that says, exception, cannot create unknown type window. Because as we discussed this, the XAML needs to know where these components are coming from. So what we need to do is we need to add the base, and I'm going to go steal this from my own pyRevit base window. So I'm going to go grab these two namespaces, which are the base WPF namespaces. I'm going to add them here. And at this point, we're good to go. If you keep these as a template somewhere in your templates for a base XAML sort of like file that you would use to start other windows and whatnot, that's completely fine. Or you could make it more complex and keep it that way. But anyways, you need to give the XAML engine these namespaces so it knows what the actual window is. So now if you run the tool, we'll get a new window. And you can see it defaults to a certain width and size and everything else. It'll pull the icon of the parent window, the window of the sort of like process that is opening this window. It'll automatically inherit that icon. and it gives you, the close, maximize, minimize buttons on the side and a border and everything else, and you're open to place whatever you want inside this window. In the next video that we talked about, we will talk about more detail about how this actual GUI windowing system and tying to the code behind everything else works. You'll know why sort of like you get a window that looks just like any other window in your Windows environment by default. So that would be a fairly easy process. Where did that window go? Here. So this window looks just like every other window in Microsoft Windows. So if I open an Explorer, these two windows are exactly like each other. Let's close this. Okay. So what I had set to do for this sort of like demonstration is to talk about the layout, the components, and setting of the attributes first. So we created the base window that we wanted to work on. Now, what I know I want to do is to sort of like go and create buttons and layouts and stuff like that, but I don't really want to manually code all of this. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open Visual Studio. I'm going to close the project that we used before for sort of like the first session presentation. And I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to call it WPF. Everything's fine. I'm going to save this inside the pyRevit tutors extension. Let's go here, and I'm going to call this, we're going to save it here inside the extension, and we're going to call it pyRevit or WPF edit project. WPF edit project. Okay, and whatever that is. And I'm going to hit OK. And Visual Studio will set this up for us. It'll create a standard window and everything else in there. We don't really need any of these because we're not going to compile this project. We just basically use this project as a template so we can work with other stuff in it. It brings all the necessary references and stuff like that and sets the right properties. So at this point, I'm going to go and select all of these and just delete them because we don't need these. I'm going to go and delete all of these. We don't really need any of these. We actually don't. I don't think we need any of these settings. Oh, I'm not going to mess with these. Let's just leave them here for now. And I'm going to right click on the project, say add existing item. So I'm going to add an existing file to this project. And I'm going to browse to the extensions, pyRevit tutor, tutors tab, settings panel, the sessions panel, and then session 9. And I'm going to go say show me everything, and I'm going to click on my XAML file, and I'm going to say open this on the side, and I'm going to say add it as a link. So it doesn't move that file into the project of the Visual Studio solution, basically. It just leaves the file where it is, and it remembers a link to it. So at this point, we'll see that here, and I can double click on it, and I can open the XAML, and it will render that window for me because it doesn't really need to have the code behind. All this window is doing is reading this XAML file and ties it to the to what we have here. Now, at this point, it tells me that sort of like it grays this out and tells me you haven't really used anything inside namespace, but keep it. This is very important. This X is something that we're going to use very quickly, and I'll show you what that is there for. So to start placing stuff in the in this window, we're gonna open the toolbox, and I'm gonna sort of like tie it here, pin it here, and we're gonna talk about two major types of the components that you see here. There's some of the components that have actual shapes and graphics and representations, like a button, like a border, like a data grid, like an image, like a label. All of these are sort of like, the actual components that we use. But there are a couple of components like a stack panel, and there are more of these inside the all. If you go here, let's look at the wrap panel here. Let's look at the stack panel here. And let's look at the dock panel under D dock panel. These components, or a grid even, these components don't have a visual representation. So for example, when I drag the grid inside this space, you don't really see anything. It doesn't really render anything. These are layout components. These components are designed to include other components in them and sort of like lay them out on the sheet correctly. For example, if at the root of my window, I'm going to delete that grid. If at the root of my window I throw a scroll viewer, let's say I have a scroll viewer here. Actually, let's this is a little bit more complex. Let's use a stack panel. Let's use a stack panel here. If I throw in a stack panel here, and then I throw a button inside it, the button goal will stick to the top of that stack. If I throw another button, it'll get placed right under it. Let's see if I throw a label in here, it'll go right under it, and a date picker right under it. So it lays out the components that are its children in a stack sort of like mode from top to bottom. A lot of these properties are configurable. So the stack panel has properties that you can adjust, but basically that's the standard behavior of that component. Depending on how you want to plan your UI and create an interface, you kind of have to place a couple of these layout components first, make sure it's good enough, it's the way you wanted it to be, and at that point we'll sort of like we'll take it from there and make it sort of like design the UI in the way that we want it to be. So it's a really good practice to sort of like draw up your user interface on a piece of paper first, determine what components, what major components there are, and sort of like take it from there. Like for example, if I want to show you the settings window as an example, this settings window at its root has a scroll component at the root. So everything is sitting inside a scroll viewer, because when you open components and they get too long, too tall for this window, it'll let you scroll through those components. And then you have a couple of expanders sitting inside it and a bunch of dividers, and each expander has a bunch of other components in it. Like for example, an expander has a title and everything, but it can expand and collapse the components, its children, basically, like that. So a lot of these components, you kind of have to learn the behavior and decide how you want to use them and how you want to lay out your window based on the components that you have. For the purpose of this presentation, we want to place a text box, a label, a text box, and a button on our user interface. So it's fairly simple. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to use a stack. I'm going to use a stack panel at the root of my window. I'm going to delete all this stuff. If you don't want to see all these base properties built in, you can just enter at the end and then open a angle bracket and just type stack panel and then close it like this, or you can say stack panel. If you know it's going to have children, close it like that, and it would give you the closing bracket as well. And you have a stack panel that's sticking to the sides of the window because you haven't really set any offsets or anything else around it. I'm going to throw in my label because I want to show the user a prompt. So I'm going to throw a label in here, or you can throw it here. It doesn't really matter. If you throw it here, it'll attach sort of like margins and width and size and stuff to it. I'm going to throw my label here. My label is not going to have any of the children. I'm going to use its text property or content property. Yes, content property to show the text that I want to show. So I'm going to tell user enter your name. Let's say enter your name inside the box below. Okay, so this is the prompt that we're going to show to the user. Now, I saved the file. If I go back here into Visual Studio Code, you see all these changes are being saved to that file because that's a linked file. So at this point, we can really close this. We don't need it anymore. I'm going to close these other stuff that I have here, and I'm going to keep my IronPython script here for now. I'm going to push it to the side of the window so we can sort of like switch back and forth between the script and the window and kind of show you how things are laid out. Now, at this point, I realize that my window is kind of big. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to the window tag, and I'm going to say, give me the width, and set it to, let's say, 500, and give me the height, and set that maybe to 300. So make my window smaller. Even like, we could go even smaller than that, 350 by 200. Okay, and I'm going to set the zoom to 100, so I can see my window, the actual window. Okay, so we're creating a pretty small window. We have a stack panel that has one child, which is going to be the label. Now, I'm going to, as a second child, I'm going to place a text box in here because I want to get a text input from the user. So I'm going to find the text box. You can actually search for these things in here as well. Not a text block. I want a text box. I'm going to throw it here, place it there, move it to the second line, and that would be my text box here. So if I click out, you see the text box is there. Now, the sort of like to lay out these components, I want to make sure that this has the right height. So I'm going to give it the right height. Let's set the height on this and set it to maybe, I don't know, maybe let's say 45 pixels, 46 pixels, or something like that. Pretty larger than the label. And the border is super close to the edge of the window. So I'm going back to my stack panel, which is the parent to all these, and I'm going to set a margin on it. And I'm going to say, give me, I don't know, let's say 16 pixels margin, or maybe that's too much. Just make it 10 pixels. So it gives me a margin of 10 pixels all around that window. What margin means is this. If I go to my browser and let's look up margin, there we go. So it kind of looks like this. If this border is the border around our component, the margin is the space outside of the border, and the padding is the space inside of the border between the border and the content. And most of the times, the border have the thickness of 1 pixel, so you don't really see it. But if you increase the thickness, it becomes its own thing. The margin is the space outside of that between this child component that we have with the border and its parent component. So the margin of 10 on a stack panel means that give me a space of 10 between me and my parent sort of like component, which is the window, which in this case is the window edges. Now, if your window edges has, I don't know, thicknesses of more than 1 pixel or whatnot, you're going to see those thickness outside of this 10 pixel. This 10 pixel is sort of like inside of that border to this component. You can also specify this in multiple different ways. So I can say it's going to be left, top, right, and bottom. So if I want to say I want to have 10 on the right and 10 on the left, but nothing on the bottom and nothing on the top, I can do that as well. These are your sort of like options. If I'm pretty satisfied with that text being close to that top of the window, you can do that as well. The type for this is actually a thickness type. If I click on it, maybe it'll show me that. No, but it's the data type for this thickness, so you can accept multiple different combinations of these 4 digits for the 4 sides of this margin. So you have that. You can look at these things later on. If you hover over any of these components and hit F1, it'll actually take you to Microsoft Developer Network, and it goes through the documentation for that specific component, and you can look at all the properties. In this case, I can sort of like find the margin. I don't find it here because it's a subclass of the stack panel framework element, UI element. I think it's here. So the property belongs to the one of its parent classes. So let's go and see if we can find margin. I don't see it here. LMNO, no. Maybe it was the framework element then. Let's go take a look at these and see if we can find it here. Okay, sweet. So margin is a property of the framework element, which is a couple of parents of the stack panel. And the type that we talked about is thickness, system windows thickness. And you can look up the thickness here, and you can see that there are multiple ways you can set this up. Sort of like go find the constructors for this, and you can see you can provide various different ways of these different combinations to the thickness type. But anyway, this is how you can investigate all of these by yourself. Obviously, talking about all these components and all the available components inside WPF is not the purpose of this. The goal of this is to get you started understanding the concepts behind this and sort of like get started with the simple interface, and you can take it from there by looking at somebody else's XAML files or learn about the investigate the documentation, and learn about these components that you want to use and ask questions. So we have the text block here. I'm going to set the font size to something larger, maybe try 16. We can, I think there is a text, yeah. Let's say name. I'm gonna set this here so we can see the base text and the size. Maybe I want this to be larger. I can change the same font size. I'm gonna change the font weight also. The nice thing about working inside Visual Studio environment, it has autocomplete for all these properties and the sort of like standard values that come with it. I'm going to change that to name, to heavy for that type, and I'm pretty satisfied, except that I want that name to be sort of like in the middle of this, right, in the center. The property that the text box has that is set for this purpose is the vertical content alignment. It's not the vertical alignment. Vertical alignment is for the component for the text box itself. Vertical content alignment tells the text box the content that you're displaying inside the text box, how to align that vertically. So I'm going to say set that to center. So name and place that name on the center, and I think we can use the padding as well and give it a padding of 10 on the right side, nothing on the other side. Well, actually on the right side as well. Okay, so that would push the content 10 pixels to the right on the left side and to the left on the right side. That's we have set it here. So at this point we have these two components here. And if I decide that, well, I need a little bit more space between these two, I can click on my label and give it a margin, let's say, and it's going to be zero everywhere except for the bottom. So I'm pushing any other component that falls below the label 10 pixels down that way. So I'm pretty happy with this. The last thing that I want to place is a button inside this interface that is going to be content button by default. I'm not happy with its height. Let's set the height to something bigger, 64. Sure, that's fine. Actually, let's make it slightly smaller so we can talk about something else. 46. Let's set the content is fine. Everything else looks good. I'm going to change the content to show say hello, because we're writing a hello world program. And also I'm going to say give me a margin of 0, 10 from top, 0 from left, 0 from bottom. Okay, so it pushes the pixels, the button 10 pixels down. Okay, perfect. Now I have a little bit of space left over on this, on my stack panel, because the stack panel is following the size of the window. So what we're doing is that on the window, we're gonna say resize mode, no resize. So we're not gonna let the user resize our window because we're pretty happy with the size and we think this window should be this size. And size to content, also we want to set it to height. So whatever the size of the final components on this window are, the sort of like the height of the window is going to be that. But because we are sort of like making the height of the window automatic, we kind of have to get rid of this hard definition for the height that we have. So see, window has adjusted to whatever the final height of these components are. So at any point, if I go and change the height of the button, for example, to 64, it'll grow, the stack panel grow, and the window is smart enough to sort of like understand how it needs to adjust its height to the height of that final set of components. So I'm pretty happy with the window that I've created. I'm going to, because I checked the font style and everything else here, I'm going to get rid of this text property. I want to leave it empty for the user to enter the name. So that's fine at this point. And there is one thing else that we're going to do, but we'll get back to it after we've done the first round of testing. So I'm going to go back to my Revit. We don't really have to do anything on the code behind side because, you know, there's not much that we have done. There's no logic or anything else. So I'm going to go back to Tutor, click on this thing, and we should see our window pop up. Perfect. Okay. So this is our window. Oh, we are missing a title for the window. We're going to set that. And everything else looks fine. It's still pulling that name from here. I think we haven't saved that. Yes, we didn't save that change, and I'm going to also to add, I'm going to put all these size adjustments on one line. I'm going to add the title here. I'm going to say hello world. Perfect. Okay, save the file, go back to Revit, run it again. And it's a little bit slower because I'm running this on a virtual machine, so it's going to be a whole lot faster on your machine. And at this point, I can go here and type my name, and the user can type other stuff, and sort of like the component is smart enough to scroll the text as you're typing up more text in it. Okay, perfect. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to add a function to the code behind. So when we click on this button, right now when we click, nothing happens because it doesn't have anything tied to it. At this point, we want to be able to sort of like put a code behind this that when the user clicks on this, it'll read the name from the text box, and it would say hello Hassan or anybody else. So I'm going to close that window, and we are almost done with the window that we have here. What we need to do is to go to the code behind and create some functionality in here that would basically would be the function that would get executed every time the user would click on this. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go create a new method for my window class. I'm going to say hello. And it's a method, so it needs the self. So it's an instance method. And under it, I'm going to import the pyRevit import form. So I can use the alert function from here. This is something that I'm just going to use for this example. You can use other stuff and your own method and stuff like that as well. Let's not make it too complex. Let's import UI, which is going to be the sort of like Revit UI, and I'm going to use the Revit UI task dialog, which you might be more familiar with. Show is going to be hello world for the title, and we're going to say hello someone, that name that we're going to put in here. That's it. Okay, great. We're going to define a property. If you don't know what properties are, actually, let's do this a little bit later, not make it too complex again. Okay, so I think we have most of this covered. UI is Revit, Autodesk Revit UI. That's the namespace you should be pretty familiar with if you're working with sort of like developing Python programs and sort of like add-ons for Revit. Okay, so at this word, we have a title for that pop-up window, and we have a base text for that pop-up window. Now, we just have to tell this XAML that this is the function that we want to run when you click on this button. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to go to the button, and I'm going to attach this as an event handler to the click event on the button. If you don't know what events are available for a component, you can just select on this and go to the properties for the component. It'll give you all the attributes and properties for that component. And also, if you hover on the top and go to the top right corner, you can switch to events, and then it'll show you all the events that are sort of like attached to that component. I don't know. Oh yeah, so that's true. When you don't see this when we are actually using, when we have deleted all the code behind this. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open this other one, the project that we made in the first video, because it has all the appropriate code behind and stuff in C# for it. I'm going to go to Window, and let's wait for this window to render. Click on the button, go to Properties, go to Events, and you can see all these events that are available for my component. And the sort of like the event we're looking for is called click. I'm going to minimize this. There's another way you can get to this. If you click on the components, hit F1 again, it'll take you to the buttons and the button class, and then you should be able to see all of these as a part of the, so the button is button base. I'm going to go one class up, to the base, and I'm going to look under events, and I can see the click for that button here. So it's a little bit more challenging because you have to go up and down on these components depending on what you're trying to see to sort of like go and understand the hierarchical structure of these. But there are plenty of ways to understand like how many different events are available to this. You could also like start typing up things like click, and then it will the autocomplete will show you a couple of things. Anything that has this little thunder icon attached to it is an event. So we're going to use the event. I'm going to put the name of this function that we created, the method that we created here. The IronPython WPF engine is smart enough to find this name and tie it to this function that we have. The only question, the only little thing, the important thing is that when the user interface, sort of like the window, when gets the message from the user that the user clicked on this button and it would want to call that function, it will pass more properties to it other than the self. So the self is there, but it'll pass two other properties and arguments to this method. So we have to sort of like provide those arguments in here. Whether we use them or not, we have to provide them, otherwise the signature of the function won't be correct. If I go back to that previous project that we made, and I go and find that button click function inside the C#, you see that there's button click, there's sender, and there's the event arguments. You're gonna add these two to our script inside the IronPython, except for inside the IronPython, we also have the self because it's an instance method. So disregard that. I'm gonna just say sender and args. Whether we use these or not, you might need to use, especially the event arguments in some of the events, because some information about that event will be passed on as arguments to this method. So, they have a purpose, but for this very simple reason, we're not going to use any of those. One of the other things is that you can just save this, like, base class as your base code behind, and just reuse this and just copy this line and create other methods that have the same signature. You don't have to call them sender and args. They can be any names. You just have to have these two argument positions. So when the sort of like the engine is calling these, it's going to have a place for it to pass these arguments to. Okay, perfect. We're going to go to Revit at this point and say this and click on this and test our method. So I'm going to open the window, I'm going to click on this, and voila, we get this sort of like task dialog that is part of the Revit API. It'll show our text. We haven't really formatted it to put the name in there, but that's pretty much it. And the window kind of like stays open. So when it's here, I'm going to click on this, it'll show me that, and everything's good to go. I can minimize this and keep the window here and just click on it. It'll show me the prompt, go back, and it goes back to the window itself. Fairly simple. Now, the next thing that we need to know is we need to read the value, the text value inside this text box after the user has entered this, right? So we kind of need to have a way. So it's going in the other direction. With the functions, we went from XAML to here. So we kind of need to provide something in here so the window, the engine knows which function to tie this this sort of like event to. In this case, we need to find a way so I can say, like, read the text from that text box. So we need a variable kind of like for that text box that's here. That is why we add this second namespace here that has the that we assign the X name to. This X allows us to provide a name for that component, and that's how you type it. So you type the name of the namespace and that specific attribute that belongs to that namespace, and we're going to use it to name this component. And we're going to name this text box. It's not a text block, we're going to use a text box. Okay, perfect. And the property that we're looking for is called text with a capital T. So I can do here, go back to my function, say name equals self, because that this text box is a child of this window, right? So it would be just like a component, a property of that window. I'm going to say that, and then text box, and then text. And I mistype this text, and then we're going to format our string with that name. I'm going to actually make this slightly more organized so it's easier to read. Okay, so we have a way of getting the text, the value for the attribute text of that text box in our code behind now because that has a name. You don't have to assign a name to all these different components. Most of these components, like the button or the label and stuff like that, they don't really have any attributes that we want to read. In case of a button, we want to respond to an event. And in case of a text box, we want to have a way of reading the changed value from here. So only assign this name to the components that you actually want to make changes or read values and stuff like that in your code behind. Don't make it more complex than it needs to be. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Revit again, click here, launch the tool. And in this case, if I say hello, it's just going to say hello because there's nothing there. And then if I put my name here, say hello, oops, say hello, it's going to say hello son because it's going to read that value and everything's fine. Now let's make it a slightly nicer and say, I'm going to go back to my code behind and say either name or if it was empty, say world. Okay, so I'm going to go here. Oops, not that one. Click on the tool again. And if there's nothing here and you click on it, it's going to say hello world. Fairly simple. So this is a basic window that we have created. Put some components in there that the user can provide value in. A lot of these components have multiple different configurations. Like this text box, you can configure it to only accept numeric values and whatnot. If you're just waiting for the user to give you a number, you can put combo boxes, date pickers, all sorts of stuff in there, and sort of like assign a name to it, read the value to these properties in your code, and do whatever you want with it when the user clicks on a button and stuff like that. There is virtually no limitation to what you can do with this. The reason that I started this sort of like introduction to XAML is that XAML is an incredibly powerful framework for creating user interfaces. The sort of like starting up with it is slightly harder, but once you get started with it, there's virtually no limitation to you. You can create all sorts of complex windows for yourself. Like for example, if I go and activate, I'm going to go here and activate go to the extensions and activate this pyRevit tags tool that we have. And I'm going to show a window that's fairly complex, and it's all written using XAML and IronPython code behind. So there's a lot of power that could be explored, and sort of like there's not much limitation in it. And the nice thing about it is that the more you familiarize yourself with it, the easier it gets for you. So like this window, the manage packages window, if you have seen it, it shows a lot of like lists in here. You can put different symbols and draw the history of the sheets and stuff like that in there. It's a fairly complex window, or like the manager's keynote, or the new print sheet order sheet index. It'll show you all the sheets and stuff like that in there. They have all been created using these symbols. Oh, in this case, we didn't have any sheets in this file. This is probably not the best example. I'm gonna go pick another one, maybe reorder sheets. Yeah, like this window with its expanders with help and all these vertical buttons with the vertical text and grids and pickers and buttons and the adjustable window sizes and everything. It's all XAML and IronPython code behind. So there's a lot of power to be explored in this, and it's a great sort of like framework to create windows with. It was slightly harder for me when I got started, but then I appreciate it every day because it's just you build up so. I agree that it's not as elegant as it should be, or maybe other languages are, but it's a pretty good system considering that it's the main framework for any applications currently and in the modern world for Windows, especially when you go into the new Windows world with the Windows apps and stuff like that. So it's a knowledge that you will be able to sort of like utilize heavily going into the future. It's a great opportunity to be able to use this framework for creating GUI interfaces. So this is a very simple window. We created that code behind handling events and sort of like initializing it, reading some values and stuff like that. One of the other things that I generally do is that there are some properties in the window that are kind of important. Like for example, the name in this window is a pretty important component. And I want to sort of like provide an easier way of accessing it instead of constantly going self text box text. of sort of like accessing that, because that's the name. It's a major input to this window, and all the other functions need to have easy access to it and whatnot. So what I generally do is to make it very clear to the person that is reading my code and myself reading my code in the future, is that I actually create a property, a Python property called, for example, name, or username, let's call it username, and I'm going to return this from here, and I would effectively create a sort of like a read-only parameter here, read-only property, and I'm going to say self username, and instead of like grabbing it from right here, I can just read it from username from here. It's either this or empty world. So you could make it very clear that this is an important property of that window that you're reading. And then I'm going to go here again, click on the tool. Perfect. Say hello. Nothing is there. I'm going to go back to the tool again, type my name, say hello again, and it works, and everything's fine. Okay, so at this point, we have a tool that works. And we talked about the XAML in the pyRevit user interface. We talked about the Python scripts loading them onto Revit, initializing the window, accessing the UI components using the XName property, and then creating a text box to enter the name and a button to sort of like show that to us. And we generally talked about how to paddings and font colors and vertical alignments and stuff like that, sort of like to lay out these components clearly, and sort of like in a nicer user interface. In the next video, we're going to talk about the sort of like the underlying components of the GUI interface, and sort of like a couple of more important concepts about single-threadedness of the UI and all these other components around it.